everyone, welcome to Painting Crafty, and today I'm going to be crafting and showing you a sweet little Valentine Slow Stitch Snowman. I'm going to be showing you how I created it using some simple stitching. About 3 different stitches is all I'm going to be using, but I'm going to be mounting it on a wooden charcuterie board because I'm a part of the What Would You Make collaboration today. We have 2 hosts today. We have Brenda with Rustic and Lace DIY, Christine with Divine Design, and a special guest, Zana at OK Home DIY. Now this is a monthly collaboration. You definitely want to check out their channels because they're all super creative. We also have a playlist for this collaboration. Click that playlist. You're going to see all of the other creators who have joined in today and sharing some really creative wooden ideas. Well, I can't wait to share this with you, so let's get started. The board I'm using today I purchased at Walmart. They have a nice selection of these wooden charcuterie and breadboards there, and they're a nice quality of wood. To begin the mixed media piece on my board, I just copied off some different prints of paper on copy paper. I like the weight of copy paper. My favorite glue to use is the Liquitex matte medium. It's a nice glue. You can layer over it. It dries really matte and it doesn't dry sticky. That's my favorite glue to use when I'm doing these mixed media pieces. Here you can see me just kind of auditioning my paper selection. When I'm setting out my colors, I kind of think of triangular shapes like top, middle, bottom to kind of spread my patterns out. I knew I was going to be building this snowman through the middle, so I wanted to make sure I had definitely some colorful pieces on the outside and patterns that you'd be able to see. I also put that glue on the very top, and it dries down really well. Now to kind of blend my pieces together, I like using gesso to be able to top coat it. Gesso is kind of a thinner white paint type of quality, but I'm able to put that on, brush it on with a brush, and then I dabbed it off with a wet baby wipe just to kind of meld my pieces together. Now I picked up this Tim Holtz set of stamps. It's a great little set. I found them on clearance at Joann Fabrics. I used the circles and I used some of the snowflake stamps in the back. I thought it worked perfect for this. I'm using Stays On ink for this process. Stays On ink is a permanent ink, so you don't have to worry about it moving around. I also have this word stamp in my collection. I've had it for a really long time. It's great because it gives the feeling of lettering without seeing any words. Once I had the ink all on, I went ahead and gave it a nice dry with my heat tool to make sure none of the ink would slide around. And then I went ahead and I used some instant coffee stain over the top of this piece. It just kind of brings my piece together and just adds that really nice glow of color over the top. Once I wiped it off with a dry paper towel, I thought I wanted a little bit more color, so I went ahead and dabbed it on, and I actually used my heat tool to dry it, just to get that nice rich brown golden color. Once it was all dry, I took some more Stays On ink in the color Tobacco, and I inked the edges. I thought it looked beautiful. You know, you could just use this board just as is. If you wanted to go ahead and put some food safe grade epoxy over the top, you could use it as a charcuterie board. But I knew I wanted to make a fun Valentine snowman, so I made a pattern for my snowman, and then I used this 100% cotton batting, which is called Wrap and Zap. It's kind of a silly name, but it's a nice, soft, warm batting, and that's what I was going to go ahead and use for my snowman's body. I made my paper templates using a deli wrap paper, which is kind of a little bit thicker copy paper. I went ahead and I cut out my pieces, and then I pinned them on to my batting, and I was just going to cut around the shape. Once I had my pieces cut out, it was time to do the slow stitching process. I'll show you some of the stitches that I used on this sample. I like using a needle threader because I cannot thread a needle for the life of me. This works great. You just slide it through the hole and then wrap your thread through the loop and pull it through. To do a knot, you basically put the thread in your fingers, take the opposite end, hold it up to the needle, give it a couple twists, pinch it, and then slide that knot down your thread. And voila, your needle is threaded and with a knot. To do the basic stitches, I do a lot of running stitches, which is a simple little stitch that you probably learned when you were a child. It's just basically up and down. The only thing you can kind of keep in mind is if you want a larger stitch and a smaller hole in between, is make sure that you do a bigger stitch, and then when you're going under and up, that area is a little smaller. That way you can have larger stitches on top and smaller open areas. Another stitch I use quite often is called a seed stitch, or a wandering stitch, you basically do random little running stitches here and there. You can do them together in groups of 2, which is what I do often. This works really well for filling up spaces. You can also do little single patterns of these too. Basically, it's a wonky little running stitch. They're not in a row. Running stitches are usually in a row. Mine are often not straight, but you could do the running stitch. It does fill up a lot of space as well. You can use running stitches to finish off your edges. There's lots of ways to do a running stitch and use it in your stitching processes. You can also use that same up and down motion to create little X's. X's look great in filling up your backgrounds as well. So you just come over at an angle, come underneath your fabric, and do another angled little stitch. This is the same part of the stitch I used to create the star stitch when I did my snowman's eyes. So basically, I'm adding another stitch in the middle of my X, and then I'm going to the top of my X and adding another stitch in the middle there as well. Pull it back through the bottom, and you have a little star. Simple as that. The other stitch I used quite a lot in this project was called a blanket stitch. You take your thread, you wrap it through the back, come out the front, come around your fabric and come through the exact same hole. And when you get to the front, slide your thread through and it makes a little knot at the top. Then you can go from your back, bring your thread through, but before you pull it all the way through, there's that little loop there. You want to go ahead and put your needle through there and pull it. The idea is to have those little up and down lines in the front and connect a little loop on the top. It's a great little stitch to be able to use on finishing off edges, and it looked great in the color red on the snowman. You don't have to make your stitches all the same length. You can switch it up. There's many ways to do blanket stitches, but I'm just new at all this stuff, so I stick with the basic. Once you get to the end of doing your blanket stitch, slide your needle on the very top, make a loop, and tie a knot. And that's how you finish off your blanket stitch. For my snowman smile, I used a stitch called a French knot. Come through the back. Once you get it all the way pulled to the knot in the back, hold your thread out and wrap your needle around it 3 times. Go back through the hole you just came through and keep some tension on there and then gently pull that knot. And that's going to give you a French knot. This is probably my most fanciest stitch I know how to do, but that being said, it's not that complicated to do this stitch. It just takes a little bit of practice. I used the blanket stitch in the red color on all 3 pieces of my snowman's body. I liked the contrast of the red, and it was a great way to finish off the pieces. Now these were going to be slow stitch pieces, which means there's usually layering of fabrics and texture. And I have these little doily pieces that were in my stash, and I wanted to add that antique quality of color to kind of match that wooden background piece I was going to be using. So I was going to attach it using a multiple of different types of stitches. Now to add even a little bit more interest, I have this little tiny square of canvas that has some paint on it. And actually this was one of the hardest pieces to stitch because it had the paint on it. You want to make sure you're using a sharp needle when you're doing this slow stitch process. It really does help with piercing the layers of fabric. I just did a simple running stitch on this piece back and forth to finish off the background and used one little simple stitch to attach it. I saved lots of little bitsies of strings. I love the look of loose strings, so I glued some loose strings on and did a layer button technique. Put a pink one on top, and then I had that little red pinkish kind of heart, and I glued that on the very top. That was for the base of my snowman. The next part of his body was going to have a different look completely. I have different little bits of fabric that I put on, and I used a variety of stitches to create an interesting background. You can kind of see how I did some of those running stitches. I did up and down stitches in between the fabric that was on there. I also did some X's and some of those random seed stitches, and it was all finished again with that blanket stitch around the edges. To finish off the back, I just simply run my needle through the back. I don't need to add very much of a knot because these are getting glued on to the board. I always look at my thrift stores to see what kind of fabrics they might have. You don't need a lot of fabric to do these slow stitching processes, and things from thrift stores work perfect for these projects. I did add 3 little red buttons to the front of that piece as well. To help me figure out where I wanted to put my face to add the stitches, I used a pen called a friction pen that will disappear with some heat. I marked the location for my eyes and an area for my nose, and then I included little dots of where I was going to put the French knots for his smile. To do the eyes, I was creating those little star eyes, so I did an X, and then I completed my stitching by going up through the middle and then off through the sides. Having those little marks with the pen kind of just helps me able to center out my face and know where to start. To create my nose, I wanted a little bit raised 3D element, so I used some paper covered wire, floral wire, and then made it up and down, bent it into a carrot shape, took some embroidery floss and then wrapped it in an orange color, adding a little bit of glue here and there to hold my embroidery floss on. Once I had the nose created, I used just a shade of darker embroidery floss and stitched it on, making sure my needle was staying close to my wire, and then sewed on my nose. I really liked the way it turned out. Now to add some cheeks, since this cotton batting is very soft, I knew paint wasn't going to work and blush was going to work much better. So I just took a Q-tip and rubbed some blush on. I put the pink one on first, and then I decided maybe I wanted it a little bit darker. So I had another blush that has a little bit of glitter in it, and I used that just to add a little bit more darkness to his cheeks. I'm thinking that looks pretty cute. To create his hat, I was going to be using more thrift store fine fabric, and this is just a little bit heavier bit of burlap, I believe is what it is. It's a little bit tighter weave to it, but I gave it a roll in my hands to be able to create more of a frayed edge and make those little threads kind of stand out and be a little bit more frayed and have that rustic look to it. I knew I was going to make the rim out of the same thing. And since this is a slow stitch process, I knew I needed more layers than just one. The fabric wasn't quite sturdy enough. So I took some cotton, I think it's kitchen towel is what it is, coffee stained. I made a layer out of that, and then also some red and white ticking fabric. It made a nice layered feel to it. It was 3 layers. It was going to add a little bit more bulk to my fabric and give me something to stitch into. I added a little bit of lace doily behind that as well, put on a red heart, and then stitched around my heart using some running stitches and some X's to go ahead and attach it. You can also see I added a little bit of black thread down below. I think I added a little bit of pink there too. Did the same thing to my rim of my hat and layered that across. I think it's going to look pretty cute, and added the buttons, of course. Gotta have some buttons on that cute snowman. I used some hot glue to attach my pieces, and when I placed them on my board, I wanted to make sure that they weren't overlapping. That blanket stitching looks so pretty, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't covered up, so when I placed my pieces, I made sure that they were touching each other but not overlapping. When I got to the top where the head was, I did slightly tilt it just a little bit to give that face just a little bit sweet look to him. Now the hat, it did need to overlap the top part of his head because you wanted to make it look like it is sitting on his head and not just like on top of the head. So I did bring it down a little bit over the forehead of my snowman, glued it on, made sure I took the rim but didn't go too far down. I don't want to cover up his eyes, but I still wanted to make it look like the hat was sitting on his head. I think it's looking pretty darn cute. I know, I say cute a lot, but what other word could you come up with besides cute? To finish him off, I decided he needed a scarf, so I used some more of that coffee-stained kitchen towel and wrapped it across his neck, but I didn't want it to look like it was so flat, so I did little dabs of glue and then kind of squished the fabric, squished, ruffled it a little bit in my fingers so it had more of a 3D element to it, instead of being too flat. Once I had that on, I decided it needed just a little bit more white to it, and I had a small piece of lace in my stash, and it worked perfectly to add just a tiny bit of white to this area. And I did the same thing. I kind of just squished the fabric in my fingers and created a little bit of a knot or maybe even a little rosette off to the side. I thought it was a nice touch to be able to finish this little guy off. Let's take a look at what this Valentine snowman looks like displayed in my studio. I wanted to say a special thank you to our hosts today, Brenda, Christine, and Zana, for hosting today's What Would You Make collaboration. Make sure you check out the links to their channels inside of the description box, as well as click that playlist so you can see all the pieces that people create using wood today for this What Would You Make collaboration. If you're new to my channel and you like doing art and crafts, come on over and see what I'm doing. I'd love to have more creative friends join me. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today, and hopefully you'll come back, and next time you'll create right along with me.